Hi, it's Alabama Annie with another episode of Stories and Songs for you. Today, I was listening to the news while I was having my coffee this morning, and I heard a repeat story about the potential for food shortages, and that is a possibility due to these unusual times we live in. And it is a good thing to eat locally sourced foods. Whether you grow a garden or you know how to go out and gather edible plants from the forest, or how to fish, or how to hunt, or how to raise a pig organically, things of that nature, or chickens, it is good to know those things. And so that reminded me of a story that a friend of mine in Mentone, Alabama told me about 21 years ago about a woman who went out to forage foods on a regular basis and made dishes from them to eat. And at the end of this story, I wrote a little song based on this story that I will attempt to play for you. I don't know if I can get through it. I just came up with it. It's a silly little ditty. But here we go with Miss Betty's Creepy Casserole. Miss Hattie said Betty Crump was an odd sort, and Hattie said she wouldn't touch a thing the woman made. Miss Betty liked to experiment with foods, and being a retired home economics and science teacher, she had plenty of time and knowledge in the way things worked. She knew which mushrooms and fungi were edible and what not to eat. So she presented no danger of poisoning anyone with her culinary experiments. She just nauseated a lot of people who weren't used to that sort of thing. You would see her out walking the trails with a sack slung over her shoulder and a ragged old pair of dungarees and one of her dead husband's plaid shirts most times. And that sack would be filled with all kinds of squiggly, wiggly things like earthworms and grubs and tadpoles, mushrooms, berries, and roots of plants, including cattails. She would make cookies and pies out of the oddest things. Miss Hattie told me that once Betty had brought a casserole to a church dinner, and she said it looked delicious, and her husband, Uncle John, and several other people had scooped up some of the casserole onto their plates to eat and commented how delicious it was, until someone asked Miss Betty what was in the casserole. Well, she said, some vegetable broth and grated cheese, stewed tomatoes and earthworms, oh, and some cattail shoots, fresh gathered, of course, and sautéed wood beetle larvae. She announced this as several of the people at the table slid back their chairs and ran for the door with their hands to their mouths. Once at school, before I knew about Miss Betty's baking experiments, Mr. Timmons, our teacher, had invited her to come and give a talk about wild edibles or food that you could gather in the forest. She brought along a platter of cookies and some crunchy bars for us to snack on during the talk, and told us all to help ourselves as she began telling about roots and nuts and berries, wild fruits, rose hips, tree sap, pine nuts, pine cones, and sumac. She even told us about edible flowers as she passed around a plate of violets, dandelions, honeysuckle, and even some rose petals, and we all tried the flowers and said they were good. While she was talking, I had one of her crunchy bars and I liked it. So a few moments later, I had another. I had just finished eating them both, and the rest of the class had eaten most all the rest of the cookies and the crunchy bars, when her talk turned to living things that you can eat. She talked about squirrel and rabbit and groundhog and raccoon and quail and dove and grouse, wild turkeys, duck, bird eggs, bear, wild pig, and deer. Then she turned to fishes and reptiles. She talked about bass, brim, catfish, crawdads, and then moved on to the frogs, the minnows, the lizards, the snakes, and even salamanders. Sometimes, she said, I gather grubs. Grubs are little crustaceans and they eat wood. If you find a dead tree on the ground and dig around in it, you will find them there, and they'll taste quite like shrimp when you boil or fry them, she said, holding several wiggly grubs in her hand as she walked down the aisles to show them to us. And I also gather earthworms and beetle larvae, and in fact, those crunchy bars are made from grubs and larvae, she exclaimed. Miss Betty announced this as there were sounds of gasp and looks of surprise on the students around me, while Mr. Timmons sat smiling as he munched on the last of the cookies. Some of the kids complained to their parents that Miss Betty had made us eat bugs, and she never was invited back to the school, but I'll have to admit, the cookies and the crunchy bars weren't all that bad, and none of her food would kill you, but it was just the thought of an earthworm casserole that set some folks' tummies to rolling. So there we have Miss Betty's casserole. Now I'm going to attempt to play you that song I wrote. Yeah, this should be interesting. Lizards and salamanders, earthworms and cattail shoots, rose hips and sumac roots with the mushrooms thrown in to boot. We got nuts and berries, wild pears and spotted newts, pine cones and frog legs, and some sassafras too. I don't need store-bought foods, pork chops and steaks. I don't need anything. I'll just eat snakes. So there we have it, a song to go with Miss Betty's casserole. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I can't believe I got through that little song. And see you soon.